PolyTheism is a podcast at the intersection of sexuality, identity, relationships, and spirituality. If you're seeking a deeper spiritual connection in these areas of your life, we're hoping to be companions on your journey.
Whether you've been hurt by religion and are looking for healing, identify with a faith tradition and are looking outside of the box, identify as spiritual but not religious and want more, or are looking for meaning beyond what is in your life, we believe we can do this together.
Through love, curiosity, and wonder.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, Sandra.
How are you?
I'm doing all right.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm a little emotionally crispy.
Yeah?
This last week has been good as far as learning and growing within my polyamory.
And also, learning and growing within your polyamory means that there have been relationship issues to work on.
Bum, bum, bum.
Yep.
And when are there never relationship issues to work on?
That's not a thing. There's always something.
Yeah, my married partner and I are working through a program that is encouraging us to deepen our connection by changing how we communicate, how we interface with one another on a daily basis, with the hope of increasing attachment and security while decreasing dissonance and anxiety. And so far, so good.
That's a big thing to be doing with any kind of relationship that you're working on, whether it's a friendship or a marriage or anything else. Working on those deeper issues and finding ways to be on the same page and to connect in a real way often means digging into some dark stuff. So I applaud you both for doing that work, and I know that it can make you a little bit frazzled at the edges.
Just a little bit. And from both of our experiences, polyamory is not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
In any sense of the word. And it really demands a lot of self-assessment, a lot of self-introspection, and accountability, really. And a lot of communication. Going through the learning process has been amazing when it comes to my development of myself and my compassion, capacity for love. It's also been, oof.
Yeah.
Oof. Oof is a verb in this context.
I tell people all the time that stepping into polyamory is going to unearth all of the assumptions, all of the base expectations that you had that you didn't even know were there in any other relationships that you have. And you're going to have to question those, and you're going to have to decide the value of each one and whether or not you want to keep those expectations and assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And we are here today because what are we talking about today, Sandra?
Oh, are you asking me?
What are we talking about?
So, let's talk about sex, baby.
Let's talk about you and me.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about all the good things and the bad things that could be.
So
Let's talk about sex.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. This is an episode in which we're going to just talk about ways in which spirituality and sexuality and sensuality intersect. How about we jump right on into it? One of the things that I really wanted to start with is just a reminder of what the difference is between religion and spirituality. Just so that people understand we're not talking about sex in religion, although we are going to bring up some religions. And that is really your expertise, Justin. So can you?
Yeah. So, as we said on prior episodes, difference between spirituality and religion is that every human being, because we are meaning-making creatures, have an inherent spirituality, and our spirituality is lived out through our existential and ontological search for meaning and being.
What is ontological?
I'm glad you asked me that. So ontological refers to how we understand who and what we are at the base of our being. It is the questions of what does it mean to be human? Why are human beings the way they are? How do we be human in the world? What are our beliefs about why human beings are here in the first place? Those are all ontological questions. And the existential questions are all about kind of meaning in our lives.
Who am I? Why am I here? What purpose do I serve?
Yeah, and all of those things. And so those pursuits, in the way I define them, are how human beings experience spirituality. Now, religion, of course, is the container from which we sometimes pour our spiritual experiences. Religion can offer a lot of benefits. It can create structures of understanding and belief. It can create structures of meaning and community and really answer some of those big questions that are involved in ontological and existential searches. Without these containers, these questions can be really big and really scary.
And it also gives us a sense of ritual. It gives us particular means of being able to find others who share those beliefs. And it provides a wealth of ability to dive deeply into spiritual pursuits.
Exactly.
Via a particular lens, I guess. Yeah.
And so with those differences between religion and spirituality, of course, then we bring in the sex part.
Yeah.
The steamy, hot, sexy piece.
You're just trying to turn me on.
I am, actually.
Wait. You looked up sexuality and it was really helpful?
I did.
Yeah, what does it mean?
Yeah, so sexuality, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is the capacity for sexual feelings.
This is what I call a circular argument. It doesn't do me any good.
So, in many ways, that is sexuality, right? It's each individual's capacity for sexual, and I wouldn't say just feelings, but sexual actions.
Okay.
In the world. And sexual is referring to the instincts, physiological processes, and activities connected with physical attraction or intimate physical contact between individuals.
Is that a definition that you looked up as well?
That is a definition.
Okay, I was about to say that's pretty good for pulling out of your butt. So sexual is anything that makes us feel aroused, turned on, in a heightened state, desirous. Some people define it as hungry or thirsty, tying it to those things that are necessary for our continued being. It is an incredibly integral part of ourselves. I do, however, really want to note that sexuality doesn't necessarily include anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
There are plenty of times when I feel sexual, like, ooh, yeah, I kind of want to, that kind of feeling, and I don't necessarily want anyone else involved.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a singular focus. And this is something that, God, I wish I could remember her name. I'll come up with it. We'll put it in notes or something for this. But there was a lady that I listened to on a podcast about asexuality that said, my sexuality is for me.
Mm-hmm.
And if I choose to share it with somebody else, then that's great. But I don't have to.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really good insight into it.
That's a very beautiful insight. And you yourself, you identify on the ace spectrum as demisexual. How do you experience your own sexuality through that lens?
Oh, gosh. Well, for me, and this is something that even at my age, I am still kind of developing my understanding of it. There was no real term for this when I was younger, but what I recognized was that I wasn't particularly attracted to a person's body or a person's physical type or even like a gender. I only started getting like sexually interested in somebody and like really crushing on them or getting interested in them when I found their personality interesting. And when I found their personality interesting and I felt that we had a connection there and that there was some kind of safety and sense of ability to be vulnerable there, then potentially sexual feelings could develop. And I didn't understand that when I was younger, and it kind of got me in trouble because I'm also a big gamer. So then I would interact with people who are pretending to be other people, and then I'd get interested in the character and think that made interest in a person. And I made some early mistakes, I will say, in that regard. So if, by the way, your first major crush or second major crush or current major crush is a fictitious character, you too may be demisexual.
Especially in our culture, because we're surrounded by mass media, that's probably more true now than it ever has been.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Finding connections with these characters that in many ways become larger than life and in our lives. Like, one show that I really have enjoyed over the years is the show Supernatural.
Oh, God, I love
Right?
that show. My boys, my boys.
Exactly. And I mean, I'll be honest, Misha Collins, the actor that plays Castiel, I mean, I love that character. I
Yeah.
absolutely, and I find an attraction there that is just, I don't know. It is it's sexual attraction.
Yeah.
And it is a fictitious character. I don't know if I would be sexually attracted to Misha Collins,
Right.
but maybe. I don't
Yeah.
know if Misha ever wants to give me a ring, but And I know for myself, as somebody who has really come into my own bisexuality or pansexuality and really finding sexual attraction across a lot of different identities, whether gay or straight or queer, whether cis or trans, I mean, like you, I'm finding a lot of my sexual attraction is geared towards more femme, but not always. Femme meaning kind of a feminine style, regardless of what is between a person's legs. And also that, a lot of my sexual attraction also comes from feeling deeply identified with a person on an intellectual, spiritual, and physical level, right? It's never just one thing. I mean, I can say that somebody's really sexually attractive physically, but that is also not necessarily the basis of I'm going to go over there and have sex with them and that's it. That's never been me.
Yeah, exactly. The same for me. Like, most of my partners have been people that I've known for a while, for a decently long while. My husband's somebody I knew for 5 years before anything happened between us. And then, of course, when that spark was there, we just knew the spark had been there the whole time. It didn't take a long time to get us into a relationship. So
and sexual attraction and desire, as we know, can sometimes shift and morph during a person's life. My own married partner identifies as asexual now, and that is something that they have really come into within the last couple years, and yet has been kind of something that has been developing over time. But of course, when we were young in our teenage, and 20s, the sexual drive seemed to be a lot more powerful.
Not to mention that when you're first together, when you get first together with somebody, there's always going to be a little bit more of that pull.
Yeah.
Because the chemicals themselves are drawing you that direction. And by chemicals, I mean the things in your brain.
All the fun.
All the hormones. And, my own partner has shifted. He was, when we got together, a little bit more 50-50 on the Kinsey scale, and has definitely shifted more towards homosexuality in that. And every step of the way, we've talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an important thing to keep in mind, that even in sexuality, those shifts don't necessarily mean we become incompatible with the people that we were compatible with before. Maybe it changes, but it doesn't have to end connections. And since I think if you've listened to episode 1, connection is something that I consider to be basically my higher power, you can understand where sexuality and spirituality connect for me.
Definitely. And one of my core beliefs is that our spirituality, our emotions, our mental state, and our physical bodies, these are all integrated together. I don't subscribe to the Cartesian split that somehow my mind and my body and my spirit are these separate entities that happen to be in the same place at the same time, right? And I really believe that as human beings, we are these multifaceted creatures that spirituality is a component of our being, right? Our mental, emotional state is a component of our being. Physical state is a component of our being, and yet these are all pieces. And sexuality, out of that definition, also involves not just the body; it involves the mind, the emotions, and the spirit. It's all of these pieces all together.
Yeah, and oh my goodness, talk about ontological and existential questions. Again, when I was younger, I tried really hard to separate those, the mind, the body, and the spirit, and focused almost entirely on the mind. I was one of those people that went to college at 18, finished at 22, went straight on into grad school, studied for years and years, had plans to become an academic. I was in my brain so much. And the academic community really kind of frowns upon spirituality, or at least it did when I was there. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of pressure not to get involved in any discussions in relation to that, which made the people like me who were, interested in tarot and who, knew pagan circles and things like that, who were not default Christians in the Bible Belt where I got my degree, but still had some spiritual interests and practices, were looked upon as very weird.
Well, and religion, especially bringing up Christianity, since here in the United States, that is kind of the predominant religion of our country, but by and large, not the only religion, especially right now in the 21st century. But religion has a lot to say about sex and sexuality. Kind of it's regardless of what religion it is, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, all of these, because a lot of religion is also cultural, come with the beliefs about what sex and sexuality is for the human person and for the culture and society.
You studied the Bible more than I have, but I remember things in the Bible that were very sexual, very sensual, and all of this. And yet, Christianity teaches a very specific view of sexuality and acceptable sexuality. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in that contrast, and I'm wondering if you might be able to give us a little insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, the history of Christianity goes back into Judaism, which is Christianity came out of Judaism with Jesus of Nazareth, who was a rabbi in the first century. And because it comes out of Judaism and other Semitic traditions and religions of that time also in the ancient world had integrations that between men and women, where in many ways women were considered property.
Yeah.
And because of those gender dynamics within cultural traditions, these extended into the religious traditions. And so Christianity, even from its beginning, has always had these cultural components of women being not necessarily full human beings and equal with men, but also human beings who, like slaves, could be owned, could be sold, could be exchanged. And so sexual purity was really important for these cultures, especially when it came to inheritance. And so you needed to try as much as you could to make sure that children could inherit from the father. And if you didn't know the father, then you could have all these disputes over inheritance. I mean, that's really a simplistic version of the complexity of gender dynamics within Christianity.
But if you could look at the Bible, and I think this is really interesting, the Old Testament is full of examples where a guy is like, man, you can't give me kids, so I'm going to sleep with your sister.
Yeah, and these are ancient traditions. Hebrew scriptures, which is known as the Old Testament in Christian circles, the collection of religious texts in the Jewish tradition, go back millennia. And some of these really early scriptures where it talks about polygamy, it talks about people with multiple wives and things like that. That was, a deep cultural piece of what it meant to be human in that time and place and part of the world. And slowly...
Wait a minute. Are you suggesting that religion and culture are intertwined?
I am suggesting that they are intimately, even sexually intertwined.
Well played.
And I believe that that's true all over the world. If we look at Islam, the Islam that is practiced in Southeast Asia is different from the Islam that we find in the Middle East. Even in the Middle East, we find differences between the Islam that is practiced, say, in Turkey or Palestine with that is practiced in, say, the United Arab Emirates, or in Iraq or Iran. And so because these are all different cultures, each piece of Islam, while there's a lot of overlap in belief and in practice, there are also these cultural components that will be different from society to society. And we say the same thing in Christianity, the same thing in Buddhism. And it really is, each culture and society takes on the religious flavor of the belief systems that it finds itself kind of surrounded by.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the same thing can be said for all the different variations of Christianity that we have with the Baptists and the Catholics and the Methodists and the Church of Christ and, all of these others professing the same beliefs, but not having the same beliefs.
Yeah, and there's a lot of argument between them, even within Christianity, which is the tradition I'm mostly knowledgeable about, is you have these huge discrepancies between very conservative, very fundamentalist interpretations of Scripture, but also socially and culturally conservative, especially when it comes to sex and sexuality. And then on the other hand, you have these really liberal faith traditions, whether it's the Episcopal Church of America or the United Church of Christ, where these are very liberal, open, affirming. Gay people can get married, trans people can be priests and ministers.
Because they're all people.
Because they're all people. Exactly. And so there is more of this push toward, well, what is healthy, spiritually healthy sexuality? Which is what all of these traditions are trying to describe for themselves in their ontological and existential ways, is what is healthy sexuality for human beings.
Okay, what can we take away? Like, what is healthy sexuality between beings?
Well, that is a really good question.
Spiritually, sex, and we already talked a little bit about how sex and spirituality is intertwined in some religions. Some other places that we could look is like to Hinduism and tantric practices. I think we've all heard of Kama Sutra.
Oh, right.
There you go. Everybody's heard about these things, and so they are intertwined in some of those religions. They're also intertwined in some of the religions that predate Christianity in places where Christianity spread thanks to missionary work and colonialism, the thanks being purely sarcastic in this regard, that sex and spirituality were highly tied together, that like often sex acts were part of the spiritual practice or somewhere close to that.
Yeah. And within paganism also, a lot of earth-centered traditions around the world. Also, fertility rites and rituals were a very big, important piece of communal life, especially in ancient Rome and in Greece. There were some traditions, especially around May or around springtime, that would encourage the coupling of people. A lot of this was also about building family units and bringing families together and forming community bonds. But these were also around fertility, and they were around just as life in springtime was blossoming, also human beings really deeply participating in that act as well.
There's a lot of that thought process involved in the way that various peoples think about how we are created, right? As well. For example, Sex at Dawn talks about a culture in which, they still believe in, and I can't remember the scientific term, but the idea that a baby can be communally made by many fathers. And that women will pick their partners based on the traits that they want their children to have. So they might pick somebody who's big and strong, but they might also pick the person who is like the medicine man of the group, somebody who's wise and who has a lot of knowledge, some deep knowledge involved. Even though we know scientifically that may not necessarily be how things work, those belief systems still very much tie sexuality to spirituality.
Oh, yeah.
In creating a being.
Yeah. Which is one component of human sexuality. The drive for reproduction is definitely has always been a piece of the human sexual spiritual experience. And as we learn more and more about what it means to be human, we are also finding that the sexual experience is not necessarily tied just to reproduction. You said earlier in the episode that, your sexuality is for you.
Right.
Right? And some people don't want children. Some people can't reproduce. And yet this desire, these feelings, these activation of our neural pathways to be connected to another or multiple human beings is really powerful, and even to ourselves, right? Masturbation can be an intensely spiritual experience. And a lot of it really comes down to intentionality. If I go and take a bath and light some candles and maybe have a glass of whiskey on the side and I have some music going, so I'm kind of setting the scene, or, in spiritual or religious language, we would say preparing and setting the space for the ritual, then going intensely and intentionally into exploration of the body in an erotic and sexual fashion that builds into release and orgasm. I mean, that can be incredibly beautiful, and amazing and mind-blowing, and because it is integrated into the human experience, I mean, it's inherently spiritual.
There are actually a lot of various spiritual paths, I would say, that involve sex magic in a lot of different ways. And quite a lot of that sex magic is a one-on-one ritual. It's not something that is happening with other people involved. The orgasmic release can be the release of that energy that you have been building toward whatever intention you personally have. And I mean, who can say that orgasmic release isn't a massive release of energy?
I mean, it certainly is a biological release, and not just that, but it comes with all these neurological and physiological benefits. It can decrease stress and tension. It can increase endorphins and, pleasure chemicals. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing that we as a species have developed this sexual capacity that can be harnessed in this way. We don't necessarily know how other species experience orgasm or sex or sexuality. We know that some species do masturbate. We do know that some species have sex for pleasure. And by and large, I mean, the sexual experience of species on the planet is largely, as far as we know, kind of devoid of intentional pleasure, right? It's purely a biological process. And yet here we are as these meaning-making creatures, and sex is so big.
Right. Right? And of course, if we're being true to what we're talking about, part of that is culture. We have made sex a taboo, which makes it very big in those hidden desires. It always feels a little bit naughty, and anything you can do that feels a little bit naughty usually feels good. We've been talking about sex, we've been talking about masturbation, and we've been talking about orgasm. But I also want you to understand that when we're talking about things that are sexual and how they relate to spirituality, we're also talking about sensuality. So if you've been raised in any religious tradition, you understand that the sensual is part of it.
Yeah.
Whether it is literally being able to smell incense or being able to see particular images, or, the motions of getting up and sitting down and moving, whatever those are, there are sensual practices involved. Whether it's dancing or very specifically not dancing, whatever those things are, there's so many different ways in which sensuality, which is so strongly tied to sexuality, is also involved in spirituality.
Yeah, the sensual experience is, I would say, intertwined within the sexual experience. There are some people who, for one reason or the other, may not be able to experience orgasm, and yet are able to experience intense spiritual experiences through sensuality, just through touch, just through taste and smell and sight, and all the ways that we experience sensation, which is the root of sensuality, right? It's about embracing all of our different senses. And I mean, sex really does mix all of those together. It is a full contact, embodied experience, whether it's solo or with consensual and respectful relationships with however many people.
Yeah, I think something that is really important in that you said was embodied. In a lot of ways, I think sexual actions are the embodiment of our spiritual connections.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to note that, like, our spiritual connections don't have to be more than, like, this is going to be fun. That is plenty right there. This is going to be fun. I'm going to enjoy this. But it's still intimate. It's still a little vulnerable. It's still pushing past the envelope of your own body into a body with somebody else's. It's a connection that is strong. And this is where a lot of the kink and spirituality connects. A lot of times kink doesn't necessarily involve sex, but it does involve sensuality in many, many different ways, whether that sense is pleasure or pain or some mix of both, or, you know, something else entirely, cold, hot, whatever it might be. All of that is something that a lot of people have identified their kink practices with spiritual practices. And it goes very well in a lot of, if you look at a lot of Native American traditions, they would have coming of age rituals that would involve sensuality, that involved in some way almost violating the body, like piercing the body in some way or another, or pushing the body to a limit in some way to show that it is capable and possible and can do those things. It's embodied spirituality. It's saying, I am now answering this existential question of, am I an adult?
Yeah, and pain, you know, so the place of pain in the human experience can also be pleasure. And I think, unfortunately, in kind of modern Western, you know, westernized America where we live, pain is really seen as an enemy, right? If we are in pain, it is largely like, we got to get rid of pain, right? There's a lot of medications that get rid of pain. There's a multi-billion-dollar industries about pain management. I mean, I work in a hospital, so pain management is incredibly important, especially when it comes to human suffering. And pain can also be very integrated with pleasure. And pain and pleasure within a spiritual container, like you said, with, you know, some of these indigenous and historical rituals that human beings have had, can lift us into those existential and ontological answers. Am I ready to be an adult? Am I ready to be a man or a woman or a human being in this culture, or even for myself? Pushing ourselves into ecstasy.
Yeah, I was about to bring up that word, as a matter of fact. Ecstasy is one of those words that in previous versions of English had more meaning than just, like, nowadays we think of ecstasy as being really pretty tied to the body. The, like, you ate something that was so wonderful, or the sex was that good, or the experience of, like, I don't know, bungee jumping or whatever, gives you this, like, almost out of body experience, ecstasy. But it used to be highly tied to spiritual. They talk about the ecstasies of particular saints, don't they?
Yeah, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa in many ways is incredibly erotic. The way that Saint Teresa experiences Jesus and experiences God and the Holy Spirit is, I mean, it's a sexual experience. Or even in the Hebrew tradition with the writings within the Song of Solomon, I mean, that is deeply erotic within it. Within the chapter 2 of the Song of Solomon, you know, there's these verses that say, as an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. With great delight I sat in his shadow, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. This is straight out of scripture, right? And yet it is this delight, again, in the sensual and sexual experience, which for a lot of traditions around the world is not necessarily bad. I feel within our culture, because a lot of it comes from kind of these puritanical roots, which are specific traditions that downplayed the physical experience to heighten the spiritual, we've inherited a lot of these identities that unfortunately has made sex and sexuality into a sin.
Yeah.
And you and I and this podcast and a lot of other psychological and philosophical and spiritual and religious writing is trying to move us away with this idea that sex is sinful into this realm of sex, when done consensually and responsibly, can be incredibly enlightening, can be ecstatic. Much like sometimes where we might smoke, marijuana or take mushrooms or do ayahuasca, all of these things, sex can be like that brings us into a higher relationship with ourselves and with other people.
Yeah, I agree. And that is an incredible wrap up that I think that we can bring back to why we call this podcast Polytheism. And why we were talking about it in that way is for both of us, polyamory has been a means of getting back in contact with the connection between the spiritual and the sexual.
Yeah, and my experience of polyamory, especially when it is connected to the spirituality of sex, for myself, is my experience that sex and sexuality, just like spirituality, isn't necessarily confined to, let's say, just like a particular building or a particular tradition or a particular person. That as human beings, and for myself, my experience of many human beings can be spiritual and physical and intellectually and mentally stimulating, and that there is nothing intrinsically sinful or wrong in experiencing the diversity of human connections within all of these modalities.
That's amazing. That's a great place to stop this, I think.
Well, I was going to say, for people who are listening to the podcast, yes, religion has done a lot of damage to people, especially around their sexuality, and we are going to be addressing that in future episodes of Polytheism. Is what does it mean to heal from these sexual spiritual wounds? That is unfortunately a very big part of our society and our culture.
So we introduced ourselves way back at the beginning, but we didn't actually introduce ourselves. So Justin had us write up little blurbs on who we are. I'm going to read Justin's and then he can read mine.
Sure.
Reverend Justin Almeida is a Unitarian Universalist minister, hospital chaplain, and spiritual director. He is mestizo, queer, and polyamorous, and resides on the unceded land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples. He has a Master's of Divinity with a specialization in chaplaincy from Seattle University, and identifies as a spiritual humanist.
And Sandra Elliott is a kinky, switchy, demisexual goth who makes a living putting together training programs. She considers herself white, queer, and nerdy as hell. She has a master's degree in rhetoric and writing with a specialization in adult learning. She is spiritual, but not religious.
Nerdy as well. Well, thank you. And let's talk again very soon and record it.
All right. Everybody have a wonderful weeks ahead. We'll find a good way to end these things. Right.
Bye.